Welcome to week 2 of our social psychology course. This week I'll be talking about prejudice, its sources, its impact, and some of the things we might be able to do to reduce prejudice. And I'll do that in 4 parts. In between those 4 parts, there are a couple of questions on the webpage to allow you to recap and to reflect. So you might want to split this up into more than one viewing session. But let's get started. This first video is about how prejudice emerges. And in that, I just briefly want to highlight that we are talking about some different aspects and kind of mixing them up here because they are related. But in line with the textbook, it makes sense to think about affect, behavior, and cognition. Affect generally refers to emotions, and that's where prejudice most clearly falls into. Negative emotions towards some other group. Then we have behavior, all kinds of discrimination, and cognition, the way we think about other groups. So that's where strong stereotypes, for example, might come in. If you think about one of the most salient examples of discussions around prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, Black Lives Matter might come to mind quite easily. Global protests were reignited this summer because of very striking examples of discrimination, police treating Black men quite differently from other groups. And then a lot of the interesting discussions are around why that is. What kind of emotions, what kind of stereotypes, and maybe other things give rise to such discrimination, to such different outcomes. I would encourage you to keep this example or maybe some other examples of unequal treatment that you care about in mind as I go through these mini lectures, because that will help you to think about how the different theories might apply or how they might be insufficient. In psychology, there are always many definitions of a term, but the point that I really want you to remember is that prejudice is about attitudes, generally about negative attitudes, towards a group that we then also are willing to apply to individuals who happen to be members of that particular group. So these 2 definitions are quite similar to each other. They are from 2 social psychology textbooks. So prejudice is about attitudes, it's about emotions. But if you look at what the word means etymologically in terms of the word origins, it means prejudgment. So when we talk about prejudice, we clearly imply that it is going to influence relationships, that it's going to influence behaviors. But on its own, it just describes negative attitudes towards a specific group and its members. So where might that come from? One of the most intuitive explanations is a very emotional explanation. And I'll first go through emotional explanations, then cognitive explanations, and social explanations. Emotionally, the most relevant idea is the scapegoating idea. That it feels good to be able to blame someone else. If something happens to me that I don't like, in the most obvious historic examples, unexplained sickness, it's very nice to be able to blame someone else because then I'm not responsible and I have some agency. If I can burn the witches, it gives me something to do. It gives me a sense of control. So this idea of being able to blame someone else is basically where the scapegoating notion comes from. It's interesting to note that this typically doesn't come from a place of power. It comes from a place of vulnerability, of shifting negative emotions. there's been this interesting, somewhat controversial recent article arguing that that ability is quite helpful. They were not arguing for scapegoating vulnerable groups, but they were suggesting that as an imagination, as a way of dealing with uncontrollable events and with frustration, it's actually quite adaptive. So it's one example where we observe a behavior that has negative consequences, but we might also realize that the behavior is still also something that results in positive outcomes for the individual engaging in it. So firstly, this emotional idea, it feels good to be able to blame someone else as a source of prejudice. That comes together with some cognitive sources, some thought processes. And the first one is about categorization. We all perceive categories, we categorize other people. And one thing that almost inevitably goes along with that is the perception of outgroup homogeneity. When I see someone just as a woman, that comes along with thinking about all these things that women are perceived by me to have in common. And at the extreme, or as part of that process, I might come to think of these stereotypes, these common traits as essential. So it's not something that women just happen to do, but it's an essential part of female nature. And I might come to see this almost what should be an adjective. I might come to see that as a thing that is an entity of its own. So when you think about political rhetorics, about Trump's rhetoric in his first election campaign about the Mexicans who come across the border and the Mexicans who threaten the United States, this thing, the Mexicans, became an entity that people could see, act, and could develop fear towards. That's the idea of entitivity. If I see an outgroup as being homogeneous, as being all alike, I might see those traits as essential, and I might start to see the group as a fixed entity, as an actor. If you think back to last week, we talked about social categorization theory, self-categorization theory. And you might want to think for yourself about how those two ideas fit together. They're clearly quite related. Another important cognitive source of prejudice comes from the way we think about the world, from a cognitive bias. And that's the availability heuristic. It's generally quite hard in the absence of complete information to think about probabilities and to think about shares. So I don't have an observation of all the crimes that are committed in the UK. And still, I might want to know who I should be afraid of. And the way we tend to think about that is through availability. So how easily does the thing that I might be worried about come to mind? One of the striking examples that has been discussed a lot is people's fear of terrorism, where it can generally be shown that in Western countries, your risk of dying in the bathtub is a lot higher than your risk of dying in a terrorist attack. You might want to Google this. There are really interesting debates about whether that's a helpful analogy and what it means, but it is a fact. Why are we still generally more afraid of terrorists than bathtubs? Well, because examples of people dying in terrorist attacks come to mind a lot more readily because of all the media reporting, all the conversations around it. And the link to prejudice is now that the most salient, the most available examples tend to come when distinctive events are combined with distinctive people. So if I have a small group and a rare event, and those things are reported together, I might develop this illusory correlation. So the notion that those two things are very likely to come together. And that's partly because only the distinctive elements of a situation, only those are reported and only those are remembered. If a vast majority of crimes in a country are committed by nationals, no one is going to report or remember that a certain stabbing or rape was committed by a British person. But people are going to report and remember if the same rare event was paired with a small group of people. If it was, I know, an Eritrean refugee, and that's likely to be salient, to be remembered. So these pairings of minorities and rare events tend to appear a lot more common than they are. Then we have this illusory correlation, which then quite naturally results in negative emotions. If I believe that certain groups are associated with behaviors that I dislike or that I'm even afraid of, it's not hard to see how that leads to negative emotions, to prejudice. And a final cognitive source that's very potent is this idea of system justification or just world beliefs. And the theory here is that we all feel a lot better if we can believe that we live in a world that's generally just and fair. Because then we don't need to be angry about injustices, we don't need to deal with them, or we can generally just go about our life. Clearly, if we look around, we see a lot of outcomes that are manifestly unfair if we think that there are no group-based differences. So if I think there are no differences in intelligence, work ethics, leadership potential between men and women, and I walk around in a world where most leadership positions are occupied by men, that seems unfair. The easiest way to resolve that unfairness on an individual level is to develop beliefs in group-based differences. If I develop the belief that women are just less suited to be political, military, business leaders, then the world is fair. And I can feel good about it. And interestingly, this is not just something that privileged groups engage in. Also for groups that are being discriminated against, it's often psychologically helpful in the short term to believe that they live in a just world. So there are studies that show a similar development of beliefs that explain social arrangements in a way that doesn't make them appear unjust, but that explains them using stereotypes. And that, of course, is partly a cognitive source, and it's partly a social source, because this cognitive tendency to want to live in a just world comes together with the social reality of highly unequal status between many groups. There are other social sources of prejudice. One is conformity. Quite often, certain attitudes, certain ideas are seen as part of a group's identity. And then if you share those ideas, it makes you a more valued member of that group. So if you look at political polarization, in many countries, being Republican or Democrat, in the US case, is a very strong part of people's identity. Certain opinions go along with these group labels. And then people who value belonging to the group might just conform to those opinions, even if they didn't have strong feelings about certain outgroups in advance. And then additionally, there's this notion of group polarization, of groups moving away from each other in terms of their opinions, which is something we'll discuss in detail next week. And finally, when we think about how certain beliefs are learned and discriminatory social arrangements sustained, clearly institutional sources matter. They're not typically what social psychologists look at least not a lot. But obviously curricula are really important. If history in school is taught as the story of white men discovering and civilizing the world, it's unsurprising that many students internalize the idea that white men have certain positive attributes and other groups less so. So there are lots of pushes for example, teaching more Black history as part of a history curriculum, for showcasing a wider range of thinkers and researchers in other subject areas, and that might be an institutional approach to reducing stereotyping. Related to that, we have representations in media and culture, where members of certain groups tend to be portrayed in certain roles, in certain contexts, which leads to a learning of stereotypes and to a transmission of prejudice, of emotions. And finally, we have arrangements in law and the labor market that lead to inequality. And then that combined with our just world beliefs serves to reinforce the prejudice and the stereotypes that underpin those laws, those social arrangements. One other possible source of prejudice might be realistic conflict. This was studied, and the term was popularized by Sharif and Sharif, who ran a famous summer camp study. The idea there was that two groups of boys arrived on a campsite. They didn't know that the other group was even there, so they got to know each other, developed friendships, and then they were brought into contact. And the researchers encouraged some competition between the group. And then they showed that those sport competitions led to intergroup rivalries, and those rivalries over certain prices, certain goods, escalated into destructive intergroup behaviors and led to negative attitudes towards the other group. This study, even though it's one of the most famous studies in social psychology, is actually rather problematic. So I would encourage you to read the book chapter as suggested on this study. Still, it's worth remembering that sometimes there are real conflicts between groups. And it's easier to engage in those conflicts if you develop negative emotions towards the group you are in competition with. Doesn't always happen, it certainly doesn't happen as naturally as Sharif and Sharif suggested. Quite often groups also meet, play together, and don't start destroying each other's camps. But sometimes realistic conflict is a source of prejudice. Another big theoretical approach that very much ties into the first cognitive source I talked about, categorization, is social identity theory. And the main idea behind social identity theory, which links back to what we talked about in terms of the social construction of the self, is that it's a fundamental human need to have a positive social identity, which means to belong to social groups and to have a positive view of those groups, and to imbue that belonging with meaning. And the way we do that is by developing a belief that our group is distinct from other groups. So being a member of the psychology department wouldn't mean much if I don't think that there is a difference between members of the psychology department and members of the sociology department. So I develop this notion that the groups are distinct, and I develop a positive view of my group. And that tends to also be true for low status groups, because it provides a source of self-esteem to belong to any group that I view positively. However, viewing my group as positive and different from others implies often that I see other groups more negatively. And there is some interesting debate around whether we see outgroup hate as often as we seem to see it. So do we actually see people wanting to harm other groups? And do we rather just see them liking and privileging their in-group? Both can lead to outcomes that aren't okay. If people only hire people for jobs who look like them, to some extent it doesn't matter so much if they don't hire other people because they don't like them, or if they hire people who look like them because they do like them. But clearly it implies some things about how we might want to deal with prejudice. So this question of when we have out-group hate and when we just have in-group love is quite important. Partly because it has been suggested that any kind of categories, just whenever people are put into groups, might lead to the formation of prejudice. But that idea has been challenged. And there's some research that actually categorization is not enough. It also needs to be linked to uncertainty. There needs to be a motivation to imbue the categories with meaning. We'll run an in-class experiment on this, and then we can discuss it further. But that concludes the first video. So take a moment to also engage with the questions. Maybe make yourself a tea, and then I'll see you back in the second video. Thanks for watching so far.